Notebook 11. The 296th Regiment in Champagne. From the 19th of May, 1916, to the 12th of July, 1916. Part 2. On the last episode, Barthas and his comrades were pulled out of Hill 304 and the Verdun sector. They were resting in a small town in the rear when new orders arrived, sending their 296th Regiment to a new part of the front line. After an exhausting march under the rain and a trip by train, the poilus arrived at their new destination, the region of Champagne in northeastern France. We left them when they were just arriving at their new barracks, and we shall now see what happened after that. Barthas commented that those new barracks turned out to be in a truly desolate place and state, hidden in the middle of a pine forest, with a road and a river that cut right through the middle of the encampment, while for a bed the soldiers only had a floor of wooden planks which they had to walk over with their muddy boots all day long, and for pillows they only had their packs. There was no straw for the soldiers. All available straw went to the officers and the officers' horses. This was their new home for the moment. One day during their stay in that forest, there was an assembly where many decorations and promotions were given. Here Barthas was at last officially given back his rank of corporal. Barthas wrote that he was completely indifferent to the rank itself, but he was happy that with it he managed to annoy both the commandant and the captain that had tried to punish him. Together with his rank, Barthas was given command of the 6th Squad, a practically inexistent squad which consisted of a barber, a drummer, an orderly, and other staff employees that were always carrying out duties and which were only seen at meal times. There was only one man in the squad that was fit for combat duty and that accompanied Barthas to drills and inspections. This was a withdrawn school teacher called D'Artigue, who never gave any excuses and whose face never showed any emotion. His face additionally showed such an incredible stupidity that it sometimes even stunned the section chief into silence. After eating his meal, D'Artigue would disappear as if the earth itself had swallowed him, appearing for roll calls and departures only at the very last minute and in the most incorrect outfits possible. His puttees would be undone and falling from his legs. He would be wearing a greatcoat when he was supposed to wear a jacket, and a jacket when he was supposed to wear a greatcoat. He would be wearing a cap when everyone else was wearing a helmet. His necktie would be twisted to the side, while all the straps of his pack were tied in the most haphazard way possible, barely managing to keep his blanket, tools, and mess tins from falling to the ground. D'Artigue was constantly chewed out by the adjutant and sergeants, and his name was always first on the lists for work details. But he continued on, taciturn and indifferent to everything and anyone. He did not even talk with his comrades. Barthas wrote that he often wondered whether D'Artigue's head had been damaged in the war, or if D'Artigue was a poker face, silently making fun of everyone, or a philosopher that had long ago transcended the material world, or if he was simply an idiot. Still, there was nothing to be done. Later, one day, the regiment received a reinforcement of 200 men from the conscript class of 1916. Barthas considered it an aberration to put such young lads in an active reserve regiment, where many of the men were 35 to 40 years old, or even older, and could not keep up. With these young reinforcements, the 296th Regiment was reclassified as a regular active duty regiment, meaning that it would soon serve in the front lines and perhaps even take part in attacks. Another noteworthy event happened during the night from the 30th to the 31st of May, when a German plane flew over the camp and dropped several bombs, though fortunately no one was hit. Later, on June 1st, the poilus were ordered to prepare their things, and they left the forest camp. A short while later, they reached the town of Couperly. Here they spent the day digging the latrines which the commandant always demanded. But the next day they again marched out 3 kilometers towards the town of Védenay. When they arrived, they received reinforcements from a dozen garrison towns in batches of 20 to 40 men, and so the regiment was quickly brought back to strength. The soldiers thought they would rest in the village, but on June 5th they were informed that the following morning they would leave for the trenches. And so they left Védenay at 6 a.m. and reached the village of Suippes after a 4-hour march. The town had been completely abandoned by its inhabitants. Many buildings were still standing, but from time to time airplanes or artillery would bomb the place. Only a few rear personnel occupied it anymore. The company was packed into far too tight quarters, but at 8 p.m. they were sent out into the trenches. The sector itself was calm, and after surviving Hill 304, it was practically a vacation spot for the poilus, though this was spoiled by the fact that it had recently witnessed a German gas attack, which claimed many victims. The possibility of another gas attack was real, and it terrified the poilus. Barthas' section was sent to the reserve lines, and they were stationed in deep shelters with 2 entrances. The poilus were ecstatic. This was the first time they ever saw shelters like these, and inside them they did not have to fear artillery bombardments. But gas attacks were an entirely different matter. The shelters could not keep gas out, and the preventive measures that had been installed did not inspire any confidence. At the entrance to each shelter there was only a stick of wood, a small pile of straw, and some gasoline. In case of a gas attack, they were meant to light these on fire so that the heat would dissipate the gas. Additionally, there were special grenades that were full of water and bisulfite to make the gas stick to the ground. That was all as gas safety measures went, and it was not helped by the fact that the organization was completely lacking. The poilus had no clearly assigned roles, and no one knew exactly what he had to do in case of a gas attack. Additionally, only whatever officer was assigned to a particular dugout stayed in that dugout. The sections changed position every 1 or 2 nights, and so no one could prepare things or carry out any maintenance on the gas defense measures. And so the water in the containers became stale. The bisulfite disappeared, the canisters rusted, the gasoline was used up by the poilus to warm their dugouts, and the wood and straw got soaked in the rain. If there ever was a gas attack, the poilus would have little more to rely on than the whims of the winds, and so they installed makeshift weather vanes at each outpost and shelter in the trenches, and the poilus read them anxiously whenever there was a slight breeze. Though Barthas said that eventually they all got used to this ever-present danger, just like they had all gotten used to all the other dangers of the trench war. The night after their arrival at the trenches, Barthas' half-section was sent up to the front line to reinforce the observation outposts. These outposts were mostly manned by squads of no more than 3 or 4 unlucky soldiers that had to stand there for day and night watches almost without interruption. For various reasons, over 2/3 of the effective strength of the companies had been kept at the rear lines, exempt from outpost duty. Barthas wrote that every day one would see more and more young and strong men around the command posts of captains and commandants, carrying out vague functions like orderlies, cooks, aides, rationers, tailors, and barbers, for in exchange to serving these officers they were saved from serving at the hell of the front-line trenches. But returning to the story, Barthas, together with 3 men, including the strange D'Artigue, went to reinforce an outpost occupied by a 2-man squad. It turned out that the previous night a German shell had fallen in that outpost and had wounded 4 and killed 1. The poilus were very nervous about occupying such a clearly targeted outpost, but fortunately for the next several nights, the German artillery left them alone. Later, on June 15th at 3 a.m., they were relieved by another battalion from the regiment, and after a 4-hour march, they encamped in barracks back at the desolate camp at the forest. A few days later, on June 20th at 8 p.m., they were again sent through the trenches to carry out a mysterious work detail for which no explanations were given. As they approached the trenches at a forest called the Caterpillar Woods, they were split up into smaller groups. The next night, Barthas was sent together with 3 other comrades to help at the railway station of the village of Chenil, 800 meters behind the front lines. Here, entrenching materials were brought up in large amounts by narrow-gauge trench trains. Due to the danger of artillery fire, the trains themselves stayed one station behind, and the carts with supplies were dragged by some miserable and skeletal horses. The station chief was a fat man who walked around with the ego of the biggest Paris station master. He chewed out the poilus for being late and had them work until midnight without ever giving them even a simple thank you. When they finished, the sky threatened with a heavy storm, and the poilus hurried to get back to their barracks, but in the complete darkness they lost their way. At one point, Barthas climbed a pine tree to orient himself by the light of all the flares from the trenches which marked north. Barthas was leading the group as they moved through the forest in the darkness, when suddenly, to their terror, 2 voices shouted out, "Halt! Who goes there?" And Barthas found himself facing the points of 2 bayonets. Then he saw that the faces behind the bayonets were black as ebony. Barthas wrote that he was surprised at seeing black soldiers in the middle of Champagne. He cried out, "Comrades, we are not Germans. Please let us pass." The 2 sentinels discussed between them for a moment and then pulled out their bayonets. They spoke French very well and told Barthas and his comrades that they were from Martinique. As a brief aside for those who do not know, Martinique is an island in the Caribbean that nowadays is a part of the French Republic, though back in 1916 it was still a French colony. Returning to the story, it turned out that these sentinels were from the regiment neighboring Barthas' own, and in that regiment there were quite a few Martinican soldiers. The sentinels let Barthas and his comrades pass and gave them directions to help them get back to their shelters. When they reached their new shelters, they were surprised to find wire mesh bunks, 1 for each soldier. This was a luxury they had never before seen. Barthas commented that whoever supplied all that wire mesh to the army during the war must have made a fortune. War did not treat everyone equally. The next night the poilus were sent to the front line to help dig strange, shallow and projecting trenches that had 2 or 3 steps at the end. The higher-ups did not tell them what the purpose of these earthworks was, but it was very easy to figure out that these were shelters to launch gas from. Soon all the soldiers knew that there would be a poison gas attack on the Champagne front. There was talk of how new and deadlier gases would be used, and groups of brave men were being formed on each regiment to scout out the battlefield after the gas attack. These men would be issued with gas masks, and experiments were already being carried out in the rear on the effectiveness of the gases and the masks. During those anxious days, Barthas discovered that near the shelter where he had to work, there were Martinican soldiers that stood guard at the parapets. They were silent and melancholy, probably thinking about their homes at the other side of the ocean. Barthas talked with them to try and get to know them better. He wrote that the poor men had no military spirit, and they shivered during the cold nights. He discovered that the Martinicans had been told that the Germans were monsters, and had been convinced that if France fell, then the Germans would invade Martinique and enslave all of them. And so the Martinican soldiers accepted their fate as inevitable, being used by the army as cannon fodder. Later, one night, Barthas and his comrades returned from work to find their shelter surrounded by around 30 very young men. It turned out these were volunteers and forced conscripts from the classes of 1917 and 1918, practically kids. Barthas wrote that they were beardless, with their eyes giving insolent looks and their talk disrespectful. Some of them had the faces of girls or 15-year-olds, yet they were a peculiar group, which Barthas described as being steeped in vice. Several of them came from reform schools. Some had stolen money from their bosses, while others had worked at the post office and peeked into private letters. One of them had been bored and decided to kidnap a 14-year-old girl whose parents had not wanted to give to him in marriage. There were even some who, despite being so young, had already been convicted as pimps, and they liked to show off all the letters, packages, and monies they received from their hands. These kids had all been offered a deal. If they served in the army, they would be released from prison. Barthas was sad to see that the kids' rehabilitation for stealing would be to go out and kill and be killed in war. There were also several poor orphans who had been deceived by the newspapers into believing that military service was a great life, full of adventure and glory, and an easy way to escape their public tutelage. All these young rascals were assigned to the 15th Company, and to his surprise, Barthas was assigned a squad of 12 of these kids. His old squad with D'Artigue and the others was taken away to reinforce some other squads. Barthas wondered why his superiors thought he was considered an appropriate choice to command those young rebels. The kids themselves were ecstatic at not being sent to a penal battalion, and were astonished at being so close to the front lines. They frequently sang and danced in joy to the surprise of the older soldiers. Barthas ended up caring deeply about those kids. He wrote that they always treated him with respect and even affection. Barthas did not treat them roughly, instead behaving more like a comrade and an older brother. He took care of them and even wrote applications for and managed to get them charity awards, war godmothers, and grants. Barthas wrote sadly of how those kids who developed a touching attachment to him had nothing and no one to care for them in the world, and many of them only had Barthas to weep for them when the war claimed their lives. While this happened, the work on the gas shelters was finished, and the poilus returned to the forest barracks during the night of the 29th to the 30th of June. As soon as they returned, and every day after that, the poilus had to carry out exhausting drills and maneuvers under the scorching sun. It turned out that during those days, Colonel Duz, who had led the 296th Regiment since 1914, had been sent away to command an infantry division. His replacement was a Colonel Robert, who had decided that it was necessary to carry out new, unending exercises and issue dozens of new orders to whip the regiment back to shape. He was particularly obsessive over the uniforms and greatcoats, constantly carrying out inspections and throwing a fit if the smallest detail or part of the uniform was misaligned by 1 centimeter. The soldiers dreaded to think what it would be like when they had to go to the front lines with this new, maniacal colonel. Meanwhile, Barthas wrote that the young troublemakers under his command were always hungry, but were poor as church mice. So he constantly worked and asked around with his acquaintances to get them extra rations. He got a lot of help from his Pairia comrades Richardy and Maisonneuve, who worked as cooks for officers and non-coms and informed him when he could get leftovers from the kitchen. Then, on July 4th, there was a sad accident. An artillery wagon drawn by horses and with 5 gunners on it was crossing a railway track when a passenger train crossed at the same time and smashed it to bits. 3 men were horribly mutilated and died almost immediately, while 2 others were seriously wounded. The 3 dead gunners were buried without ceremony, and no one gave the incident much thought. So was war. But the tragedy proved to be a blessing for others. In the crash, the horses had been killed, and so they were butchered and the meat distributed among the companies. Barthas had a friend from his old squad called Jalabert, who worked as a butcher and who secretly gave to Barthas and his young squad 2 sacks and a platter with the best cuts of horse meat. And so they all decided to have a feast by cooking the meat into steaks. They all pitched in to buy some oil. One of the kids managed to find a small cooking pot missing its handle, and soon a fire was blazing and the first steak of horse meat was cooking. One of the impatient kids poked the steak with his knife to see how it was cooking and accidentally knocked the meat over and into the fire, where it was burnt immediately. There was a general howl of rage, and Barthas had to intervene so that the impatient fellow did not learn his lesson through bruises. But this was a minor distraction. Soon they had more meat cooking on the pot, and for the first time in a long while they all ate until they were full. Barthas also commented that during those days there was a complete reorganization of all infantry regiments. The battalions were reduced to 3 rifle companies, the 4th being disbanded and replaced with a machine gun company. The men of the dissolved 4th company were spread out across the other rifle companies, and so Barthas received his old Périac friend Paul Alpech into the squad. With Alpech's reinforcement, they finally managed to maintain some order among the young troublemakers, who were always ready to fight with each other. Additionally, Alpech was a cook, and so he inevitably became the squad cook. He took this duty with great solemnity, and the squad was joyous at having good meals. After returning from drills, the squad's youngsters would rush towards the smell of Alpech's cooking pot, and to the cook's despair would start dipping their pieces of bread into the broth, under the excuse of inspecting how it was cooking. So Barthas used his full authority as corporal to grant Alpech a fishing rod, with which he could whack the young rebels to keep them in line, and they soon developed a respectful fear of it. And so life continued. One day at assembly, the sergeant major asked for a volunteer corporal from the 15th company that would go on to a training assignment to learn how to use a new trench cannon. The idea of escaping from the mad Colonel Robert for a few days was very tempting, so Barthas volunteered and got the assignment. 2 days later, he left together with a dozen other privates, corporals, and sergeants. They arrived at a place known as the Bois Farm. It had been a legitimate farm during peacetime, but now it was a large center for military training and experimentation. There was everything here from grenadiers to snipers and machine gunners, among many others. There were also a lot of slackers and rear echelon personnel like instructors, officers, their aides, and even the divisional squadron that was resting for the great breakthrough of the trenches to pursue the enemy. And here Barthas saw Russian soldiers for the first time. But we will have to see what happened with those on the next episode. For now, we have reached the end of the 11th notebook. This has been quite an active episode. The poilus have been working and moving around in the Champagne sector while the threat of a poison gas attack looms. The regiment has a new and worrying colonel. Barthas finally recovered officially his rank of corporal. He met soldiers from Martinique and took command of 2 different squads. Now he will be trained with a new weapon at the Bois farm. We will see how things go for Barthas and his comrades on the next episode. I will see you until then, and I hope you all have a good day.